Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take your source material, look closely, and pull out the crucial insights.
That's right.
Today we're really digging into Singapore's path, its development path, which is, well, pretty extraordinary when you look at it. And we're doing this through the lens of Lee Kuan Yew's memoirs, From Third World to First.
Yeah, we've got some really potent excerpts here. They cover a lot, those intense internal challenges, the economic strategies they came up with, and, the tricky foreign relations stuff they had to navigate.
Building a nation from scratch, essentially.
Pretty much, yeah, in a complicated region.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Our mission here, for you listening, is to pull out those key bits of knowledge, the insights about Singapore's journey, and, I guess, the thinking behind it all.
Right, the why.
Think of it as a shortcut, maybe, to understanding the core pressures, the big decisions, some of which might seem a bit counterintuitive, and the principles that really guided them.
And it's all drawn directly from these accounts, these excerpts we have.
What's fascinating, I think, and what comes through in the sources, isn't just a dry list of policies.
No, not at all. It's the philosophy underneath it, the pragmatism that comes up again and again, and frankly, the sheer willpower you read about in these pages.
It's about why they did what they did, isn't it?
Exactly. So let's jump right in. What do the sources tell us about where things stood right at the beginning?
Okay, so Singapore finds itself suddenly separate from Malaysia. It's this tiny island city-state, Southeast Asia. It's a tough neighborhood, right?
Definitely.
And the sources, they immediately flag this core belief, something that seems to have just driven everything from day one.
Absolutely. Yeah, the perspective in the memoirs is, well, it's crystal clear. Singapore could not be ordinary. If it wanted to survive, it just couldn't.
It had to be different.
Had to be different, had to make extraordinary efforts, really, just to keep existing. It was a fundamental survival thing.
Right. And, okay, so stemming from that pressure, that intense pressure, what was the goal? What did they want the people to be?
The goal, as it's described, was to forge a people that were tightly knit, rugged, adaptable. A population that could do things better, maybe cheaper than their neighbors. Especially because those neighbors were, actively looking for ways to bypass Singapore, its traditional role as an entrepot.
That middleman role.
Exactly. They wanted to cut Singapore out if they could.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Survival meant proving their value, proving they were indispensable, maybe?
Yeah.
The memoirs also talk quite a bit about their most critical asset in this whole fight. What was that?
Ah, yes. The trust and confidence of the people.
Right.
And the accounts are really careful to show this wasn't just, handed to them. It was earned, hard won.
Earned how? The sources mention fighting certain groups.
Yeah, fighting against communists and also groups the sources call the Malay Ultras. And just so you know, Malay Ultras basically refers to Malay extremist or chauvinist groups. Their political agenda was seen as a direct threat to Singapore's whole multiracial idea, even its existence back then.
And the text points out that even groups you might think would be skeptical, like Chinese-speaking leftists, they saw these leaders, who they called bourgeois English-educated leaders, actually stand up and fiercely defend their interests.
Right. And the really crucial insight here from the memoirs is that this trust, once they had earned it, they couldn't take it for granted, not for a second.
You had to keep earning it.
Exactly. The sources really hammer this home, the absolute need to not squander that trust through bad government or, crucially, corruption. That deep political legitimacy, that trust, was seen as totally essential if they were going to make the most of the few assets they actually had.
Which were mainly?
Well, primarily that amazing natural harbor, world-class, and just its strategic location, right on a major sea lane.
Leveraging geography, yes, but only possible because they earned and kept the people's trust.
Okay.
Got it. Let's move on then. How did they build some of the pillars of this new nation? The sources talk about a people's army. That sounds unusual for a small city-state.
It was, yeah. And the inspiration, the sources tell us, came straight from Israel. That model of rapid maximum mobilization.
The idea being?
The idea was, despite the small population, they could train and mobilize a really big chunk of their citizens quickly into a credible force.
But getting people on board with that, with mandatory national service, with a people's army, That wasn't easy, was it? The sources mention a kind of traditional dislike for soldiering.
Oh, definitely not easy. There was this widespread traditional view, yeah. They even quote that old Chinese saying, a good lad does not become a soldier.
Good steel does not become nails.
Right.
Exactly. So how did they overcome that deep-seated view?
What was the strategy?
Well, the strategy described in the memoirs, it was pretty comprehensive. It involved setting up things like National Cadet Corps in secondary schools.
Linking the army and police directly to family.
Yeah, to the sons and daughters of ordinary people. The main goal really was to flip that existing fear or resentment of uniforms, of authority on its head.
Make people see soldiers, police as protectors, defenders. It was a long-term cultural shift they were aiming for.
Right, changing that fundamental perception, that seems key. Okay, another major pillar they discuss is home ownership, getting people to own their homes.
Yeah, this was seen as absolutely vital for political stability.
Why stability?
Well, the problem, as sources frame it, was having this totally urban population, which in many places historically tends to vote against the government in power.
Okay.
So the idea was make householders homeowners, give them a stake, and you create a more stable electorate, people who have something invested in the status quo.
And the sources mentioned a very specific, almost clever link to national service here too.
Exactly. It was about giving the families of those national servicemen, the soldiers, a real, tangible, personal stake in defending the country.
So the thinking was?
The thinking was, a soldier isn't going to feel like he's just fighting to protect rich people's property if his own family owns their home.
Oh, right.
And the sources really stressed this. That sense of shared ownership, having roots in the ground, was considered absolutely vital for building a new society, one that didn't have those deep, shared historical or communal roots like older nations.
Sounds like it wasn't just a housing policy, was it? It was nation building, national security even.
Very much woven together, yeah. The sources also detail a very deliberate decision to avoid something that was pretty common in other developed countries back then.
Which was?
Deliberately avoiding what they called the welfare state trap.
Okay. What do they mean by that?
Well, they were observing countries like Britain and Sweden and seeing the rising costs and, well, what they saw as the debilitating social effects of these big welfare systems.
And the argument in the memoirs is quite stark about this, isn't it?
It is. It basically says when the government takes over the primary responsibility for families, for individual well-being, people's own drive, their self-reliance, it weakens. Welfare was seen as undermining self-reliance. It could lead to handouts becoming a way of life, maybe reducing motivation, productivity, and making people dependent on the state instead of independent.
So what was their alternative then, if not that model?
Their alternative was the vigorous promotion and growth of the Central Provident Fund, the CPF.
Ah, the CPF, which...
It's Singapore's big social security savings scheme, but it's primarily a mandatory personal pension fund.
Right.
And the sources really emphasize how this was designed to avoid that welfare dependency. Pretty much every worker builds up their own pension fund balance, and it's apparently paid out directly to beneficiaries if someone dies without lots of legal hassle.
So a fundamentally different model, based on individual and family savings, not state handouts.
Exactly. Individual responsibility savings, that was the focus.
Okay. Moving on to the economic transformation. Huge part of the story. The sources point to the very foundations of their industrialization push. Where did that start?
A key figure mentioned is this Dutch economist, Winsemius. He led a UN mission back in 1960.
Right.
And his first report in 61 apparently laid out two preconditions for Singapore's economic success.
Two conditions. What were they? They sound almost too simple in the telling.
They do, yeah. First, eliminate the communists.
Wow, okay.
Which, given how strong the communists were then, the sources say this seemed like an absurdly simple solution just to state baldly in a report.
Yeah. And the second?
Second, do not remove the statue of Stamford Raffles.
The founder of modern Singapore.
Yeah. Much more symbolic, that one, and obviously easier to fulfill.
So dismantle a huge political threat and keep a symbol of your trading routes.
Okay.
Then there was the massive job of converting all that British military land and facilities after they pulled out.
Yes, that happened really quickly between 68 and 71. Figures like Sui Sen and the EDD, the Economic Development Board, they spearheaded this.
And the goal was?
Actively attracting global companies, investors to set up shop, set up industries on that land the military left behind.
And did it work? Did they manage to absorb the job losses from the withdrawal? Because that must have been huge.
It seems they did. The source specifically notes 30,000 retrenched workers from the British bases were absorbed by these new industries in that short time frame.
Wow.
And they mentioned it was kind of good fortune, timing-wise. The handover was done by 71, which was before the big 1973 oil crisis hit.
Ah, okay.
So that allowed the conversion and the industrial growth to happen when the world economy was still relatively buoyant.
Timing helped. Now, how did labor relations fit into all this, especially during that early period, that sort of emergency footing?
Context was everything, apparently. The unions, the workers, they were genuinely shaken. First by separation from Malaysia, then the looming British withdrawal.
So they were more receptive to tough measures.
That's what the sources suggest, yeah. They accepted what's called a hard-headed approach from the government because they understood the situation was genuinely an emergency. The nation's existence felt threatened.
The memoirs mention specific examples, like getting rid of triple pay for public holidays. That must have been unpopular.
Oh, yeah, exactly. And there were protests from union leaders. Naturally, they had to respond to their members.
So how did the government handle that?
The approach described was, well, twofold. Firmly override the public protests when needed, push the reforms through, but also, crucially, meet privately, directly with the union leaders.
To explain things.
Yeah, to explain the worries, the severity of the situation, and the absolute need, as they saw it, for a trim and lean workforce if they were going to compete internationally. It was about setting a whole new, much more demanding framework for industrial efficiency.
Pragmatism again.
Yeah.
And that long-term view seems to extend to big infrastructure decisions, too. The memoirs really detail the Air Hub Vision, Singapore Airlines, SIA, and building Changi Airport.
Yeah, that's a huge one. After the breakup, Malaysia, understandably, wanted to bypass Singapore wherever they could.
Including air travel.
Right. So the joint airline MSA was broken up. Singapore's strategy, knowing they had limited land, was just go international.
Yeah.
Fast. Build up a massive network of destinations.
And they mention a key figure, Lim Chin-bang.
Yes, he's highlighted as someone they cultivated within MSA to lead Singapore's side when the split came.
Which happened in '72. MSA splits into SIA for the international routes, MAS for Malaysia's internal ones. But the airport decision, that seems pivotal.
It really was. The initial recommendation from a British consultant in '72 was actually just to build a second runway at the existing airport, Paya Lebar.
Why there?
Well, even though there were known engineering issues, the land costs were lower, and it meant less disruption, less resettling people.
Okay.
And even after the oil crisis hit, American consultants apparently initially recommended sticking with that Paya Lebar plan just to keep things on schedule.
But Lee Kuan Yew, according to the memoirs, he wasn't convinced.
Not at all. He questioned the basic assumptions. He personally pushed hard for the other option, moving the entire airport to Changi, which was an old military airfield out on the eastern tip of the island, to be seriously looked at again.
And that decision.
The sources present that decision as absolutely fundamental to SIA's later success and profitability, making it one of the world's most successful airlines, especially for its size by the late 90s. It was a huge visionary bet, really, against the initial expert advice.
A big call based on strategic foresight, going against the grain. Okay, let's turn to some really sensitive domestic and regional issues now. The memoirs talk about integrating the Malay settlements.
Yeah, this is described as a very, very sensitive matter. You had these large concentrations of Malay communities living in, well, pretty poor conditions, slum-like, really.
In areas like Geylang Serai?
Geylang Serai, Kampong Ubi, Kampong Gamba, yeah. The sources paint a picture over 60,000 people, no piped water, no proper sanitation, just muddy lanes between shanty huts.
And the memoirs mention Malaysia's Prime Minister, the Tunku, made an offer.
He did. Offered free land over in Johor for any Singapore Malays who felt, abandoned after separation.
Did the people take it up?
Interestingly, the sources say very few did. Singapore's own plan was this huge 10-year process. Demolish the shacks, resettle everyone into modern high-rise public housing like in Queenstown.
But that must have had a huge human cost, even if the housing was better. The sources are quite candid about that, aren't they?
Oh, absolutely candid. Even with generous compensation, it wasn't enough for some, especially older people, farmers, who really missed their old way of life, having space for animals, fruit trees, that sort of thing. The memoirs explicitly note that many from these resettled communities kept voting against the ruling party for years afterwards. They felt their traditional life had just been destroyed. It's a stark acknowledgement of the trade-offs involved in that kind of rapid modernization.
A powerful example of development hitting communities hard. Language and identity. Also very complex in such a diverse place.
Especially for the English-educated generation, it seems. They felt sort of deculturalized. The text uses the phrase lost between two cultures, separated from ordinary Chinese speakers who use dialects or Mandarin.
And what about the newspapers, the vernacular papers?
They often didn't help build a unified identity, according to the sources. They tended to cater to narrower communal interests.
Like,
Well, the Malay paper, Utusan Malayu, is specifically called out for making itself a vehicle for pan-Malay Indonesian nationalism, actively working against the idea of a distinct Singaporean identity. So the media landscape was pretty complex in that nation-building phase.
reinforcing divisions rather than unity.
Mhm.
Okay. Another constant theme, a critical battle described, is the fight against corruption.
Yes, the memoirs are frank. They acknowledge corruption existed at lower and middle levels, police, inspectors, that sort of thing.
But the real fear was
The potential for big takers. Corruption right at the top, in the higher levels of government, public service, that was seen as the existential threat.
so what was the strategy against that? Especially the big takers.
It was multi-pronged, it seems. They decided to really focus enforcement on those higher levels, the big fish. The thinking was, if you succeed there, it sets the tone for everyone else.
And for the smaller stuff, petty corruption.
Simplify procedures, remove bureaucratic discretion wherever possible, sometimes even just getting rid of permits altogether, just to cut out the opportunity for small bribes. And they also kept tightening the anti-corruption laws over time because getting convictions under the old laws was apparently quite difficult.
The sources also highlight using lawsuits as a kind of strategic tool.
Absolutely. It's detailed how suing people who made allegations of misconduct or defamation against ministers or officials became a deliberate tactic.
Why? What was the goal?
To establish a political climate where politicians had to defend themselves publicly and rigorously against any such accusation. If they didn't, they'd lose public trust. This is sharply contrasted in the memoirs with the situation in many neighboring countries where corruption was, well, rampant, and allegations might just be believed without any real challenge or consequence.
Because in that kind of environment, just being accused could be fatal politically.
Exactly, unless you fought back transparently. And the memoirs point out that opposition MPs were also involved in these legal fights on both sides.
Right, suing and being sued.
Yeah, instances like Chiam Si-tong winning damages against Papi ministers, or Jaret Nam suing Go Chak-tong and losing. The key takeaway presented is that the ruling party ministers felt they earned respect and kept credibility by being willing to face scrutiny, cross-examination in court whenever their integrity was questioned.
There's also mention of an incident involving the U.S. Embassy.
Yes, allegations of foreign interference involving an opposition figure, Francis So. That's presented as another example where such matters were handled very firmly and publicly, accountability enforced through the legal system, at least partly.
Okay, let's shift focus now to foreign policy. How Singapore navigated the world stage, its closest neighbor, Malaysia. Relations stayed complex, didn't they? Even after separation.
Oh, definitely. The dynamic described is often one where Malaysia wanted to reduce its dependence on Singapore, maybe bypass it altogether.
Like with trade and infrastructure.
Yeah. Examples given are Johor planning to stop the railway line inside Johor, develop Pasir Gudang as a rival port. The memoirs even allege direct interference, like the Malaysian Special Branch supposedly paying an opposition candidate to defame Lee Kuan Yew, which apparently got exposed on TV in Singapore.
But things did improve later, under Mahathir.
Yes, the sources note a significant shift then. Malaysian ministers, officials became much more open to learning from Singapore, even praising things like Changi Airport. Visits increased, apparently, specifically to study things like productivity, urban planning, and a really key positive moment mentioned is Malaysia formally affirming they'd honor the 1962 water agreement.
Which was crucial for Singapore's water supply.
Absolutely vital, but persistent disputes remain too, like the issue over the railway's customs and immigration facility, the CIQ.
What was that about?
Well, Malaysia apparently changed its mind about moving their CIQ checkpoint out of Singapore's Tanjong Pagar station up to the border at Woodlands. Singapore argued strongly that having Malaysian officials operating way inside Singapore territory, without Singapore counterparts alongside, would create huge operational problems and, well, tricky sovereignty issues. This remained a point of friction, according to the memoirs.
So, always navigating those neighborly complexities. Singapore also had to deal with communist regimes in the region, Vietnam, Cambodia.
Yes. With Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge, the sources recount this Well, chilling meeting with Eng Sary.
Pol Pot's brother-in-law.
That's him, foreign minister. His appearance is described as mild, unassuming, which is contrasted sharply with the horrific genocide he was part of.
And why did he want to meet?
Surprisingly mundane, really. He was looking for barter trade, offering fish in exchange for things like spare parts, pumps, motors, though apparently that trade never really took off.
And Vietnam. They went from being seen as heroes after the war to villains.
Regionally, yes. After defeating the U.S., they invaded Cambodia, which went against international opinion, especially within ASEAN. They got stuck in this long guerrilla war there and eventually pulled out.
And Singapore's role.
The memoirs describe Singapore being heavily involved in the really painstaking diplomatic effort within ASEAN and with outside powers, trying to smooth over differences between the various anti-Vietnamese Cambodian groups, trying to broker some kind of political solution.
So Singapore played a key role in coordinating ASEAN on Cambodia. What was ASEAN's main purpose then, from Singapore's perspective?
Well, its stated aims were economic, social, cultural, but the memoirs are clear. The real focus, for Singapore at least, was always political. Stability, security in the region.
Did it achieve much initially?
Progress on the stated economic projects was slow at first, apparently. Lots of proposals, not many actual projects getting done.
But the 1976 Bali summit is mentioned as a political success.
Yes, definitely. It was seen as showing ASEAN solidarity at a really uncertain time after the Vietnam War ended. It also helped Indonesia's President Suharto internationally after the whole East Timor situation, though Suharto himself often preferred bilateral meetings over big ASEAN forums.
And coordinating on Cambodia was a big part of ASEAN's political role.
Huge. They managed to present a united front. It involved a lot of work resolving differences within ASEAN, getting Malaysia and Indonesia on board especially. And this unity was crucial to reassure the U.S. that ASEAN wasn't just backing a return of the Khmer Rouge.
There's a specific example of how they shared the burden.
Yeah, it's quite detailed. The U.S. agreed to fund the non-communist resistance groups, but only with non-lethal aid. Malaysia provided training and uniforms, and Singapore, using its small defense industry, supplied lethal aid, AK-47s, grenades, that sort of.
A very concrete contribution to regional security efforts there. Heck, what about China? Engaging with China must have been a major, evolving relationship.
Absolutely. A big shift happened. By 1971, China stopped its public attacks on the Singapore government. The Bank of China branch in Singapore even started flying the Singapore flag on National Day. And Singapore actually became China's second biggest source of foreign exchange, after Hong Kong, through trade and remittances. Though the sources also mentioned Singapore required its companies dealing with China to register, so the government knew who was doing what.
And crucially, China changed its stance on overseas Chinese, didn't it?
That was fundamental. Huge. Beijing started recognizing the citizenship of residents for ethnic Chinese living abroad. They stopped viewing them automatically as Chinese citizens.
They abolished the Overseas Chinese Affairs Commission.
Yes, and said they wouldn't interfere if countries abolished Chinese schools or newspapers abroad. Premier Zhu Enlai is quoted making it clear. Overseas Chinese wasn't the right term for those who'd taken up citizenship elsewhere, and China would not support communist movements trying to overthrow governments in Southeast Asia from the outside. That removed a massive source of potential friction and suspicion.
The memoirs describe Lee Kuan Yew's 1976 visit to China in fascinating detail. It sounds like it was very carefully managed.
Meticulously. The whole thing was designed to deliberately avoid any impression of kinsman Chinese returning to the motherland.
How so?
Well, the delegation included non-Chinese members. They didn't fly direct. They went via Hong Kong and crossed the border by train. And while they got full state visit protocol otherwise, there were telling omissions. No welcoming editorial in the official People's Daily newspaper, no diplomatic corps lined up at the airport.
And the welcome banner?
It pointedly welcomed the people of Singapore, not the government of Singapore, just highlighting that political distance still existed.
And the meetings themselves involved some tricky discussions. Fencing over the relationship type.
Absolutely. Party to party versus government to government. Lee Kuan Yew writes about pressing the Chinese leaders on why they still supported communist parties abroad, like the Malayan Communist Party, which still aimed to liberate Singapore.
He gives assessments of the leaders he met.
Yes, quite candid ones. Hua Guofeng, for instance, is described as lacking finesse, sticking rigidly to the party line, even when it led to contradictions about supporting communist movements. The sources also note how Chinese officials fluent in Southeast Asian languages were constantly present with the Singapore delegation, suggesting a subtle kind of monitoring or engagement strategy.
But on later visits, Singapore noticed big changes happening within China.
Definitely. After Mao died, they describe a much more relaxed atmosphere. People seemed freer to speak their minds, more openness, more transparency.
They mentioned the issue of social pollution in the new economic zones.
Yes, that came up. And Deng Xiaoping's pragmatic response is quoted basically saying, when you open the windows, you expect some flies and mosquitoes to come in, but you can deal with them. The benefits of opening up outweighed the downsides.
And China became quite interested in studying Singapore's model, didn't it?
Very interested, specifically in how Singapore managed to maintain strong social discipline and moral standards while rapidly absorbing Western tech and systems for economic growth. They sent lots of delegations to study this.
Which led to the Suzhou Project.
Yeah, eventually leading to the Suzhou Industrial Park Agreement, which is described as a software transfer, essentially transferring Singapore's planning and management expertise to China for this huge project.
And the memoirs offer a long-term view on China based on all this interaction.
They see the leaders as pragmatic, capable, with good successors coming through. But the key prediction really is that growing exposure to the West will fundamentally change the younger generation. They'll realize China isn't going to be the Middle Kingdom again, but rather one major player among several advanced nations.
Okay, turning to the U.S., relations with the United States also shifted over time, particularly under President Carter.
Yeah, Carter's focus shifted quite dramatically, more towards human rights Africa, and he planned troop reductions in Korea, which apparently caused a lot of concern among Asian allies who relied on that U.S. security presence.
He's described as meticulous.
Meticulous, yes, but sometimes questioning things allies saw as essential defense needs. The example given is him questioning Singapore's purchase of defensive IHawk missiles, seeing it perhaps through an arms proliferation lens. Though the U.S. ambassador in Singapore apparently intervened later and the sale went through.
The Reagan era was different.
Very different focus, all about containing the Soviets, Reagan's evil empire rhetoric.
There's an anecdote about Taiwan.
Yes, Reagan apparently asked Lee Kuan Yew to pass a message to Taiwan's leader, Chiang Ching-kuo, asking him to delay buying certain high-tech U.S. weapons. The speculation in the memoirs is that the U.S. needed China's tacit help against the Soviets at that moment.
The U.S. role in the region generally.
Yeah.
It's assessed quite critically in the memoirs, but also seen as essential.
It's a real duality, yeah. The sources are quite candid about perceived U.S. mistakes, like backing, then dropping Diem in Vietnam, sometimes being heavy-handed, maybe lacking historical understanding of the region, potentially having a bias against ethnic Chinese.
But despite all that,
the U.S. is called the irreplaceable backstop against communist expansion in Southeast Asia. The sources credit the U.S. with ultimately stopping Chinese and Vietnamese communist expansion and supporting key figures like Indonesia Suharto until the failed communist coup there.
And how did U.S. figures see Singapore? George Bundy is mentioned.
Bundy, a former national security advisor, is quoted calling Singapore basically a tibbler, small fry.
Yeah.
But he saw Lee Kuan Yew personally as sane, rational, steady, mainly, it seems, because of his strong anti-communist stance and his views on Vietnam.
The memoirs also comment on the U.S. political system itself.
Yeah, from that outside perspective, seeing it as having three key parts: the administration, Congress, and the press. With Congress and the press often reacting to complex foreign issues in quite simple ideological East-West terms.
And the U.S. role in Cambodia supporting the resistance.
Yes, providing that non-lethal funding. It showed they were getting over the post-Vietnam reluctance to get involved again, the Vietnam withdrawal syndrome. It complemented what ASEAN countries were doing.
Then under Clinton, another shift, especially regarding China.
Yes, after the Taiwan Strait crisis in '96, there was a period where U.S.-China relations seemed to stabilize. Clinton's assessment of China's leader, Jiang Zemin, is relayed quite positively in the memoirs, describing him as having great intellect, energy, vision.
And U.S. influence on Taiwan's internal politics is noted, too.
Yes, how U.S. media and congressional pressure pushed Taiwan towards democratic reforms. Lee Kuan Yew recounts advising Taiwan's Chiang Ching-kuo that to keep broad U.S. support from the White House, media, and Congress, he needed to open things up politically.
Which Chiang then did.
He lifted martial law, allowed opposition parties, yeah. Though Lee Teng-hui's later controversial comments about Taiwan and Moses leading the exodus are also mentioned, hinting at later complexities.
The memoirs are full of other international observations and anecdotes, too. There's a critique of Western aid and why developing countries often failed.
Yes, failure is put down to things like uncontrolled population growth, ethnic conflicts, weak institutions, corruption. They're called soft societies, lacking a strong hand or a solid legal framework.
There's an interesting point about expelled minorities.
Yeah, like Indians in parts of Africa who often acted as informal village bankers. When they were expelled, that role was often irreplaceable, severely damaging local economies. A specific example of how ethnic dynamics played out.
Commonwealth meetings also feature some pretty pointed comments.
Yeah, recalling controversies like arms sales to South Africa and regretting when confidential discussions became public. There's a bit of a swipe at UN diplomies, that vague, non-committal language.
And observations about leaders.
Contrasting leaders who were charismatic versus those who could actually get things done administratively. And a slightly amusing anecdote about leaders from bigger countries arriving in private jets, while Lee Kuan Yew deliberately flew commercial initially to maintain Singapore's third world status.
Until the World Bank ruined it.
Exactly. Until the World Bank reclassified Singapore as developed.
Some specific leaders get quite frank assessments.
Oh, very frank. Chatichai's government in Thailand called the most corrupt ever, epitomizing money politics. New Zealand's Muldoon seen as a bit soft on policy, while his successor Lange gets credit for making tough but needed subsidy cuts.
Bangladesh's leader.
Mujibur Rahman seen as a hero, yes, but pointedly observed having his private jet sitting idle at an aid conference, which didn't project the right image for a country needing aid.
And the comparison between Uganda under Idi Amin and Cambodia.
Yeah, using the tragic example of Uganda, where the sources say people basically lost the habits of civilized life and just grabbed whatever they wanted, to illustrate the kind of societal breakdown police encountered in Cambodia after years of chaos. It shows how deeply ingrained order can be destroyed.
There's also a strong defense against critics of so-called Asian values.
Yes, the argument made forcefully in the sources is that things like corruption and nepotism aren't inherent to Asian or Confucian values. They're a debasement or distortion of those values.
The solution being
Transparent systems that check abuses. The problem isn't the values, it's officials using public office for private gain and refusing to accept market discipline or the rule of law.
And European views on human rights in China are mentioned too.
Yeah, citing West German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt. He apparently pressed China, not necessarily for immediate Western democracy, understanding that wasn't realistic, but specifically on adopting universal human rights standards, pushing for tangible progress on basic rights acceptable globally.
Okay, so pulling all this together, it's crystal clear from these accounts that leadership, finding the right people, was just seen as absolutely paramount.
Oh, completely. The sources hammer this home again and again. It was the decisive factor in Singapore's development, the ability of the ministers and the exceptionally high quality of the civil servants backing them up.
The memoirs are quite blunt about the difference a good minister makes.
Very blunt. With a lesser minister, it needed constant watching, pushing, prodding, and the result was never quite right. But with the right man, as they put it, once the goals were clear, you could basically leave them to it, and the results would follow efficiently. The burden was lifted.
And finding that talent early on involved casting the net very wide.
It did. Many early key ministers weren't even born in Singapore. They deliberately looked everywhere: South China, Malaysia, South India, Ceylon.
But there's a concern expressed for the future.
Yes, a worry that later on they were fishing in a much smaller pond, just the locally born population, and finding it harder to get individuals with that same breadth of experience, that same quality. Fewer big fish, as the memoirs put it.
The challenge of succession is obviously a huge theme running through this.
Massive. The original leadership team, they were forged in fire, really. Shared intense trauma, World War II, the Japanese occupation, the communist fight, the political battle, separation.
They were survivors.
Survivors who'd proved they could govern under extreme pressure. They had these incredibly deep bonds formed during crises. And the sources acknowledge you can't easily replicate that kind of organic leadership emergence deliberately.
Mao's Cultural Revolution is mentioned as a failed attempt.
Yeah, as a cautionary tale, trying to artificially create that same bond as the Long March veterans had and failing disastrously.
So without that shared trauma, how did Singapore approach finding the next generation of leaders? What was the strategy described?
The solution described was, well, to actively look for people with the right character, proven ability, and crucially, a deep motivation for public service.
And then hope for the best.
Kind of. The hope was that these selected individuals would then be tested by the inevitable crises the nation would face down the line, and through successfully navigating those challenges, they'd emerge as proven leaders, just like the first team had. It was selection plus trial by fire, essentially.
The sources give a very personal example related to this involving Lee Kuan Yew's son.
Yes, the account of his son, Lee Hsien-loong, being asked to enter politics by Goh Chok-tong, who was deputy prime minister then. Loong was still serving in the SAF, the Singapore Armed Forces.
And the SAF, just to clarify for you, is Singapore's integrated military, army, navy, air force.
Right. And the memoirs mention Loong's personal situation at the time. His first wife had died relatively young. His son had a visual handicap, and he apparently expressed real concerns about balancing family duties with the demands of politics.
What was Lee Kuan Yew's advice to his son then, according to the memoirs?
He advised him very strongly not to pass up the opportunity. He argued it would be much harder to make the switch later in life, especially learning the crucial groundwork, connecting with people in the constituencies, dealing with unions.
But the core message was?
The core message was deeper. He told him he had to feel deeply for the people. He had to be able to genuinely communicate that feeling. And critically, he had to be able to persuade them, to move them, to go along with his vision and support him.
And Lee Hsien-loong did decide to leave the military.
Yes, he left the CIA and contested the election at 32, won with a high majority. It's presented as a key moment in that succession process discussed in the memoirs.
Illustrating that mix of deliberate talent spotting, personal sacrifice, and the specific leadership qualities they felt were essential.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's try and wrap up this deep dive. We've journeyed through these sources, looked at how Singapore tackled its extraordinary path, driven by that intense survival need, making strategic, sometimes quite unconventional choices in building those national pillars.
The army.
Housing.
Carefully navigating really complex domestic stuff like ethnic integration, fighting corruption.
And engaging very shrewdly, very pragmatically on the world stage, regionally and globally.
And the key factors, the sources really stress, the things that made it possible. A united, determined leadership totally committed to survival. A practical, hardworking people willing to make sacrifices. And that crucial foundation, mutual trust between the leaders and the led.
The scale of the economic growth described is just staggering, really.
Yeah.
GDP from S$3 billion in 1965 to S$46 billion by 1997, and that's in constant 1965 dollars, reaching the 8th highest per capita GNP globally. The sources are quite open that even they didn't fully foresee that scale of transformation.
No, and the memoirs acknowledge it wasn't just down to Singapore's own efforts. They credit global factors, two big breakthroughs in transport, telecoms, production methods, things that basically shrank the world and opened up new opportunities for small, connected places like Singapore.
But ultimately, after all the analysis, the planning, the pragmatic calls, the sources point to moments where the leadership just had to rely on a kind of gut instinct of what would work in Singapore.
Yeah. It paints a picture, doesn't it? Nation building driven by this relentless pragmatism, strict discipline, and a very clear-eyed, sometimes maybe even stark understanding of their own vulnerabilities and the tough realities of the world outside.
So what does this all mean for you listening today, looking back at this journey from our current vantage point? Given all those rapid changes in tech and globalization, which the sources themselves mention were influencing things, even back then, here's something to think about. How applicable are the lessons from Singapore's early, intense struggle for sheer survival to the very different kinds of challenges nations face today? What aspects of building that rugged and adaptable people described in these memoirs are timeless principles that still hold true? And what parts maybe need to fundamentally evolve for the world we live in now?